Welcome to Lead Live, a conversation for ministry leaders by ministry leaders. I'm Josh Franks.
And I'm Clint Berry, and we're the co-founders of the LEAD program. Today on the show, we're joined by Dr. Phil Howard to talk about resiliency in ministry. Hey leaders, welcome into another edition of Lead Live. I'm Clint Berry alongside my guy, Josh Franks. Josh, what's going on, bro? Good to see you.
I know. I'm so excited for today. I'm happy to be back. It feels like it's been forever. Last week we were away on vacation and you had a great interview with Melissa. And so happy to be back in the co-pilot seat for this conversation today. How about you? How are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. Like, things are really great. We have a bathroom remodel going on in the Berry household, so that's fun. I've learned it used to be Christina and I doing projects together, and now that we have children, I do the projects. So it's good. Yeah. I mean, it's fantastic. There's less fighting.
At least you didn't say Christina's doing the projects.
Right. Yeah, she's happy as a clam, man. She's going to get a new bathroom, and I'm excited about it.
Lock the door to my office and hope it goes well.
I'm telling you what, man. But yeah, she's we're doing good here in the Berry household. Yeah, I'm excited about this conversation to do, bro. We have had a great about you and I together, a great year-long conversation. Yeah. You much longer than me, with Phil Howard, who's become a real friend of the LEAD program, and we're really excited to have him with a topic that is really looking forward and looking back at the same time.
Sure.
And really valuable during this COVID era and what we've entered into. I don't know about you, but I listen to podcast after podcast. Everybody is talking about resiliency, how to build it, how to get through it. Everyone is talking about this topic. And now we find ourselves in a position where it's not just the initial wave of the pandemic. It's not just the pivoting that's happening. Now is the long haul, in my opinion. It's going to be interesting to see what the Lord is developing in us, right?
Yeah, I agree. More and more conversations I've had with pastors and ministry leaders that basically feel they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't when it comes to different decisions that they have to make for ministries, whether they meet in person or don't meet in person, require masks, don't require masks. I've talked to pastors who have had people threaten to leave the church for any of the gamut of those decisions. And that just weighs on you as somebody who loves people, cares for people, wants the best for people, wants people to take those next steps in following God. For those conversations to be happening is so deflating and defeating for ministry leaders. And so this question of resiliency is so important. You and I have even had conversations about over the next 12 to 18 months, we're predicting a flood of pastors to leave ministry because of this, just being worn out, tired of dealing with those conversations. So the grit of staying in, of becoming, of growing, of becoming resilient without becoming hard and calloused is such an important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and that's one of those keys that I hope Phil can help us with, which is how do you grow some thick skin without being hard-hearted? That is really, really important. So with that, let's invite in our friend, Dr. Phil Howard. Phil, how you doing?
Good afternoon, Clint and Josh. Doing well, thanks.
Man, it's good to have you on Lead Live today. And if you're joining us, we're going to talk about resiliency in ministry, resiliency in leadership. And Phil, before we jump into that conversation, could you just quickly introduce yourself, some of your ministry background, family?
Sure.
Introduce yourself to our guests.
Married to my wife, Kathy, for pretty close to 47 years, coming up in October. And we have 2 adult children. And 2 grandchildren. I have done any number of functions and jobs in my life. In my adult life, I worked with special needs students, adolescent and young adults for a number of years. Thought I was going to do that for the rest of my life. That changed rather suddenly and unexpectedly. Ended up in the ministry, in the pastorate. And planted a church in way upstate New York, in Plattsburgh, New York, up near the Canadian border, university community there, and absolutely loved working with college students in particular. and moved from there after a little bit more than 11 years to Malone University in Ohio, and was campus pastor there for about 4 years. And then for the last this is my 23rd year coming up at TFC as a professor of spiritual formation and leadership, again, here at TFC. And I would like to say that one of my earlier experiences at TFC was having Josh as a student, and not speaking of resilience, was able to somehow figure out resilience way ahead of time before I even knew it was a term. After my time with Josh, after he graduated, I realized I had to make some decisions of whether I was going to stay in higher education or not. So thank you to Josh.
Listen, I'm here to help.
You really helped me out. And in our pre-program conversation, we were talking about, does it take pain and difficulty to develop resilience? And the obvious answer is yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. For sure. You're not alone in that testimony.
It goes both ways, right?
The people that I've helped along their resilient journey.
Yeah,
that's good. Phil, take us let's dive right into this conversation, because I want to maximize every minute that we possibly have on today's show. And for those of you who are watching online, if you have questions for us or for Phil to answer about resiliency, we would love to answer those questions. So you can put those into the chat on Facebook or YouTube, Periscope, and we'll collect those and then answer those as we go through the show today. So Phil, first off, could you give me a definition of what do you mean by resiliency? Because I think all of us are hearing this word now more than ever, but I'd like to just start out with, what's a good definition that we should work out of?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question, because we often, historically, we've looked at it simply as the capacity to bounce back. And while there's an element of that, depending on how far or how deeply we want to go with this, I think that's only one very small expression, and really not the most robust expression of being resilient. So first of all, I think resilient is innate. In other words, it's inherent. We have the built-in capacity, I think, ultimately by God's goodness and grace to us, to become more resilient. But it is inherent, and it also can be developed. So I look at it as both, and the terms that I'll use, and I'll unpack them real quickly, but both reintegrative and re-energizing process of responding to the disruptions of life. As we go further into the conversation, the assumption is going to be that ministry leaders, by definition, depicted it throughout Scripture, have experienced often multiple deeply disturbing, disrupting experiences in their life, challenges of some sort that often cut to the very core of their being. And those are, again, by nature, disruptions, and in a sense separate us mentally, emotionally, maybe even spiritually. We don't respond fully in the best ways at first, often. And so we need to reintegrate. We need to, in a sense, re-enter our life and our ministry more robustly, and then to be re-energized, not just to bounce back, but to become better people, better equipped for the challenges of life, to have energy for the long haul. And so, again, I look at resilience as the quality of reintegrating and re-energizing in response to the challenges, to the disruptions of life.
So what I hear you saying is that there's a bit of like establishing new normal, but you are also new in that new normal, so that you would have capacity as we're growing. Josh, did you have a question?
No, I was going to say, I think that's a great definition. In responding to the disruptions of everyday life, I think it's Andy Stanley that said, leadership increases where certainty decreases, or where certainty increases, the need for leadership is less. And since we're living in a time where almost nothing feels certain, Leadership is
That's right.
true leadership that says, I don't know, the path forward has been not laid yet, but let's take steps there. And the responses that people have, the flack that leaders get as a result of that, definitely increase the need for resiliency.
Yeah, you really don't have to look very far. Again, in our conversation a few moments ago, just thinking through, especially for younger emerging leaders, one of the topics that we were talking about was the experience of a lot of new college students, and most of them, a vast majority of them, are very much aware already of the difficulties of life. A clear majority have experienced some form of abuse before coming here. They've experienced family disruptions. Many of them have lost parents through death or through a divorce. It is not hard at all to understand that life really is difficult. And I use the word disruptions intentionally because many of those experiences really do disrupt our movement ahead. They really are more than inconveniences, and they're more even than an interruption. It really is a disruption.
A disruption. Okay.
Yeah.
So Phil, you were telling us about kind of 4 categories of discovery that a leader has to work their way through. So let's start walking through. First, can you give us the 4 areas, and then let's start unpacking each one of them?
Sure. I think that resilience involves a process of discovery in which we find, first of all, our story, and we'll unpack each of these as we go along. So finding our story. Resilience involves, secondly, finding our core. Thirdly, it involves finding our rhythm. And then fourth, finding our people.
Okay. All right. So story, core, rhythm, and people. And we're going to find these 4 things. All right. So let's launch into story.
Sure.
What are we talking about when we talk about find our story? Is this just like the way I grew up and where I lived? And what are the parts of our story that we're talking about here?
When I think of vocation as leadership, rather our role as ministry leaders, as vocation, we fit into the grander story, the narrative of God's activity throughout the course of human history. And this is not an original model, obviously, but God has always been active in human history through creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. And so often I say to students that your leadership, my leadership, our leadership makes sense as it is understood within the greater context of God's ongoing redemptive story. Okay. So everything that we are about reflects God's grace, His patience, His goodness, His love, His mercy, His redemptive activity in our life and then in the lives of the people that we serve. So when that is disrupted, when we experience an event, a set of circumstance in our lives, and our awareness of that broader narrative of God is disrupted, then not a first step, but certainly these all are involved in agreement together, involves finding my story. What influences have I had in my life? Who has informed me? What kind of a person am I? What was the role of my family of origin? My early development in faith? My educational background, but also my story has to do with the difficulties that I've experienced throughout my life and the ways that I've seen God ultimately bring about a redemptive perspective toward them. And so finding that and revisiting that at various stages of our life on a regular basis, perhaps even, I think is a really important anchor for our own sense of vocation and our role as a leader.
So let me ask you, would this be similar to like we're stacking up rocks, in the Jordan River, we're collecting some rocks in the Jordan, we're putting them on the riverbank, and so that we can go back to that as, kind of a touchstone to say, yep, this is a part of our story. This is what God has done for us. Is this a part of what we were doing in some of that map?
Yeah, I think so. I can look back at my own story, and I look at my childhood, for instance. There were a number of factors that have affected me, not the least of which was I had a debilitating stuttering problem all through school, all through college, and even in my master's program, even in my early years in ministry. And it still comes out every once in a while. I get tongue-tied very easily, but that affected how I understood my role as a pastor. It affects how I understand my role and identity as a college professor now, my response with students and so on. But that was something from way back many years ago, and yet it was a part of my growth and my development as a person. And I think it's valuable to go back to those kinds of dynamics periodically and reflect on those and ask, what did that mean to me? Why was this important to me? Why do I think about this? Or how do I respond to it? Yeah. And those kinds of experiences really do affect our story, our understanding of our story.
Yeah. Josh?
No, I think that's really good, and you answered some of the questions that I was going to have as far as what are the questions that you need to ask in order to find your story. One of the exercises that I do, and I'm not a counselor by any means, but as a pastor, I end up doing some counseling, is a timeline of your life, and just kind of draw the line and think back through what you would consider significant or defining moments in your life. If they're positive, put them above the line. If they're negative, put them below the line, and just try to chart those things out. And I think that's a good reflective exercise for people who have maybe never thought back about how those things have affected them, in order go, oh yeah, I've got a lot of things below the line, or there's been a lot of times where God's been faithful. And so if they're going through a real hard time, they can see a history and pattern of God's faithfulness as well. Any other kind of exercises that you would?
Yeah, that's exactly what I do. I wonder if I don't know if you got the idea from me, but I don't know that you did, but that's exactly what I would suggest. So if I can kind of speak to that, because I do the same thing with the above and the below the line. And so if I had a board behind me or with me, I'd do the same thing, but I would draw the line as a trajectory, because the line is always up and down. It's not a straight, smooth arrow, but so the events and circumstances, the reminders, the relationships, the summer trip that we did as a family or whatever, if that was a good memory, I put that up above the line. Something that was difficult, my stuttering, for instance, or other issues, I'd probably put that up below. But it's important to look at those for a couple of reasons. First of all, because as I reflect back, if I'm going to understand my story, I need to find God there. I need to know that God was active there. I need to know when, if a parent died or whatever, I need to at some point resolve or address that issue of the items that are below that line. And one of the qualities that I think that comes to us as adults as we mature is that even if we see these events as really disparate as a 21-year-old, like I have no clue the connection of that event with my life. I don't understand why that, and so we may even ask, I have no idea why that happened. As we mature, one of the expressions, I think, of our development, of maturing development, is that we begin to see a greater sense of integration of those events that seem to be disparate, but we begin to see, and here again, we go into God's story, of creation, fall, redemption, consummation, that God in some way was involved in those activities. And that really points us to our core, which would be the next thing. We don't have to stop here necessarily, but a part of finding your.
Let's keep going.
Yeah.
Okay. Part of finding your core has to do with a sense of your perspective of God, how you relate with Him, who He is in your life. So your core, finding your core, involves revisiting, evaluating, praying about issues of faith. What you really believe, what is most important for you, to examine as a result of this event or these events, in what ways are my priorities shifting? One of the qualities of resilience that I didn't mention earlier is that it is both a preventative dynamic as well as a reactive, restorative dynamic. So it may be that I've experienced, a previous real difficulty in my life, and that has created. Let's say my parents were divorced, and I'm now in a difficult relationship with my spouse. But I think back to that event of my parents divorcing, it's below the line. But now I realize that shapes my value, my commitment to my spouse. I'm not going to give up on this. We're going to do whatever we need to do in order to make our marriage healthier. So revisiting these events can bring us back to our sense of core, what's most important to us. And again, the values and the priorities, the commitments that we're making, and so on.
Phil, where does calling get placed for many ministry leaders, and within our tribe of the Christian Missionary Alliance? There is much emphasis, and for good reason, placed on God's calling into ministry, to the mission field. How does that land within the four? Is that a part of story? Is it a part of core? Is it both? Where do you put calling of God in the midst of this?
That's another podcast. Actually, I have some notes here I'd like to go there because I do think that our sense of vocation is, very simply, I define that as the trajectory of our life's contribution. And that's why I go back to this model that Josh was introducing, this trajectory line with events above and below, because all of those events, I do believe God sovereignly employs to give shape to our sense of call. And that's C-A-L-L. I'm from upstate New York, and so call is spelled that way still for us. It's just said differently.
In the Kapak, yeah.
It really involves all of those movements. The word call, vocare, Latin, means to beckon. And or an invitation. So when Jesus called the disciples, he was beckoning them. He was inviting them into something that was qualitatively different than what they were already doing. He built on that notion of being a fisherman, for instance, and said, "I'll make you fishers of men."
Yep.
So all of those early experiences, I think, give shape to this sense of call that comes from within us as it's mediated by the work of the Holy Spirit. So, yes, having a clearer sense of our identity, for instance, is paramount to our understanding of vocation, of call.
Yeah, because I think there are times when I have wanted to quit or give up or whatever. The thing that keeps me in the game oftentimes is what Jesus has invited me into when I was 18 years old, and I can't shake the calling that I believe Jesus placed on my life, the invitation to follow him and to do things with him, alongside of him. That's what keeps me in the game more often than not, especially when things are extraordinarily difficult and frustrating. As you go back to that bit of touch point to say, nope, I know my story. I know my place in that story. I know in the story when Jesus called me to follow him into a specifically pastoral ministry, vocational ministry, and I'm not I'm not going to let go of that yet. Right.
Yeah.
So,
can I speak to that a moment?
Go ahead.
Well, 5 years ago, I designed a research project in which I explored that very issue. And I think you and I have already talked about that a little bit. But I interviewed 15 ministry leaders. Some were pastors, some were leaders of nonprofits, and all of them had experienced a disorienting dilemma, a crucible, a disruption in their life. And the nature of the research was to inquire into their recovery patterns, which led me to the issue of resilience. And one of the key themes that emerged from that research was exactly what you were describing, Clint. For many of them, what kept them tied to the mast, in a sense, what kept them serving, they may change the locations or even the nature of their role, but what kept them vocationally on target was a sense of call that was revisited as a result of that crucible, of that challenge, of the disruption in life. It brought them back to a place where they asked, why am I doing this? I was going to mention this later, but I'll mention it now. The temptation, and it was for me when I was pastoring, one of the temptations was to get out of it. I just wanted to be a truck driver. I just wanted to stop being a pastor, be a truck driver. One of the pastors that I interviewed, and he's still a pastor now, but he said, I genuinely was willing to be a Walmart greeter because of the challenges of what was going on. So
I called that Bread Truck Monday. That's what I called it, Bread Truck Monday. Yeah.
But it was the sense of, I know, again, going back to God's big story, I know my role in God's story here.
Yeah.
I know what God has invited me into doing, and I'm not going to let that go. And in some cases, what they did was dramatically redirected. Or if they continued to be pastors, for instance, they pastored in much different sort of way.
Yeah.
But that sense of vocation, that calling was still there. And I think it was a matter of revisiting that core and having a better sense of what that looked like.
Yeah. As I hear you talk about this category of finding your core, I think what I'm hearing is you need to figure out like what do you believe about God, others, yourself, and to be brutally honest with your current, not what you think you should do in order to agree to some statement of faith, but what do you really believe? One of the things that really encouraged me from Clint's journey, and maybe I'll let him share this story, but when he was church planting, he started a journal called The Things I Don't Believe God Can Do, basically. Clint, can you share a little bit about that?
Man, oh, dude. I've forgotten about that. So I knew I was having a lot of doubts in ministry, and I just started writing out things like, I don't believe God can get this church plant stable. I don't believe that I have what it takes to get this thing done. I don't believe that, personal stuff like that I'm going to be a good dad. Like everything that I could think of, I put it out on the journal, and I just went, God, I'm just before you, and I'm saying, I just don't think, because I know I can't do this stuff. Like, this is above my pay grade. So that falls on you. So, like, here is all of the stuff that I just honestly, I don't think you can do. And doggone it, did like almost all of those things just start falling off the list. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. It was absolutely amazing. Wow. So I think we should all write our gut feeling on, because God goes, oh yeah, well, watch this, sucker. But I think that was just a phenomenal time for me. And man, Josh, thanks for bringing that up. That was a moment for me, because it revolutionized the way that I went, okay, yeah, God's got that, but I literally had to go through that moment of saying, all right, at a gut level, I don't think this is going to go. But after that season, I'll be honest, I've never had to do that again.
Yeah.
is crazy.
And I think the nature of these challenges are such that it does invite that brutal honesty that Josh was referring to. I think it's, we can't, we're not playing games here,
Right.
This is, my family's involved, the people in the organization or in the church are involved. I mean, they're all going to be affected by this. My own sanity, but even as important, my own perspective, my relationship with God, my practical theology, my relational theology are all really put at play in these circumstances.
Yeah, and I think also when you get a good sense, like the enemy plays for keeps, like you get a different sense of what kingdom work is going to get to be about, and you begin to play. It's not rainbows and sunshine, which I don't think a lot of ministry leaders are there for. However, it's the arc of ministry is always not up and to the right. And when you start playing, in a spiritual realm and you start working there, and then the enemy takes a real swipe at you, that's when you have got to, in the building of all these four domains of finding story, finding core, we'll go to the next one, and finding rhythm. What we're doing is we're setting up shop. We're building our house on the rock, And so what we're doing is we're going back into intimacy with Christ issues, deep stuff there, but moving our way forward because the enemy is ravaging around. He's roaring around like a lion waiting to eat you up. And if you don't believe that, then you and I need to have more of a personal conversation, because I'll tell you when he ate my lunch. All right. Mm-hmm. And then, and I still have the marks to prove it. This guy's no joke, and he plays for keeps. And so I really feel like we've got to get that same sense of tenacity in our belief system with Jesus, and get sturdy in this way, or we will be like a ship bounced around like the waves. Phil, take us into rhythm. So we've thought about our story. We've thought about finding our core, who I believe God is, who do I believe I am, maybe what I don't believe that God can do if you're me. We put all those things on the line in terms of faith, and now we're trying to find rhythm. What do you mean by that? How do we do it?
I love baseball, and one of the things that baseball players do when they're up for bat is they go through all sorts of what I will refer to as rituals, steps that get them ready for the next pitch. And it really doesn't matter whether if they didn't get a hit, whether they swung and missed, or whether they fouled the ball off, or if they just let the ball pass or whatever. It doesn't matter. They almost inevitably step out of the batter's box. They do their gloves. They do helmet. They do all sorts of things, but it's almost always the same thing, the same practices. They get back into the batter's box, and every batter has their own approach to bat movement and their posture and what they do, and even when the ball is delivered, how they respond to it. They do that because it's a refocusing, re-energizing effort to be ready for the next pitch. And what they are doing also is leaving behind what just happened and stepping into the present, what this next pitch is going to be. And so again, it is a matter of refocusing, and it is also a matter of re-energizing and being ready for that next burst of energy that they need. What I'm suggesting with rhythm is somewhat similar. We talk about burnout, and I think Clint and I, you and I talked about this again in a previous conversation way back about burnout, and the literature on burnout is certainly increasing, but there's that popular phrase that says, "I'd rather burn out than rust out," and it's just poor theology, and to begin with, because either way, simply put, you're out. You're out of the game. But since when did God ever ask anybody to do that? Did Jesus do that? Did any of the leaders in Scripture, that were living as God intended them to, did they do that? So Sometimes we try to get over it prematurely, whatever it is. Sometimes we don't deal with these disruptions effectively. But the research on trauma in our culture is beginning to speak a different in a completely different way. I mean, most of us as parents are aware, or grandparents are aware, that there is now concern for the effect of COVID-19 on the the emotional and cognitive development of our children and our grandchildren. There's concern for trauma as this goes on. And so our awareness, the idea of burning out is really not a viable option for us as again, as an alternative. So rhythm is, I think, finding our rhythm, are finding those ways to renew ourselves as whole people. How do we care for ourselves on a regular basis? How do we care for ourselves mentally, emotionally, socially, morally, spiritually, physically, if I didn't mention that? Resilience is whole person. It's not just grit, not just girding up my loins and saying I'm gonna push through this. Resilience is whole person re-energizing and reintegrating. I come back from these experiences, or I move in through these experiences rather, as a different person. And in order to do that, I think in order to experience that realistically, that involves caring for our emotional self. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to Find Your People, but that may mean finding a counselor. That has meant that for me, finding a counselor. It may mean changing my diet. It may mean going to the gym. It may mean taking steps to improve my sleep pattern. I may qualitatively change my spiritual life habits. It doesn't. Finding my rhythm doesn't mean that I increase necessarily. If I used to read 1 chapter a day in the Bible, now I read 3.
Yeah.
But I read differently. I pray differently. I relate with my spouse differently. So rhythm would have to do with how we are as couples, how we are as families. Are we taking time for one another? Are we having dates? Are we having fun with our children or our grandchildren? What are our other relationships like with people in the life of the church or a small group or where we work? Those kinds of rhythmic steps that we introduce into our lives and maintain in order to re-energize and reintegrate our thinking and our core values.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And so realizing that what I'm hearing you say is you've got to begin or get somewhat down the road in finding your story and finding your core before you can find your rhythm, because if you skip that step, the deep work, your rhythms are going to be coping mechanisms or creating codependency in order to hide, control, responsive fear. Like I'm going to choose these things to protect myself instead of what you said, to re-energize and reintegrate, to choose intentionality to get you to what is important for you.
The one thing I would say, though, is to be careful not to identify these as sequential. And
sure.
Your point is very, very well taken, because we can create rhythms that really help us to soothe or to manage in ways that are not helpful. But it's not as if these are, step 1, step 2, step 3, and 4. This really is, what I'm suggesting really is an integrated whole approach toward building resilience.
That's good. Yeah, that's really good.
I agree with that. It's not a 1, 2, 3, 4. But how do you develop rhythms, especially if you need new rhythms?
Yes.
If you don't know what you want that rhythm to accomplish, would be my question. So for me, like, I've got daily rhythms, I've got weekly rhythms, and there's flexibility in that, but generally, like, if I don't get up at a certain time, if I don't go to the gym, if I don't take a shower, like, those are the top 3 for my day. If any of those gets out of whack, then I feel off the entire day. So,
and I would suggest that the elephant in the room on this, for pastors especially, is Sabbath.
right.
Sabbath is rhythmic, and again, that's a whole topic in and of itself. But it is a rhythmic reminder of our relationship with the Lord and all sorts of other factors involved. And yet it's one of the easiest things to let go of, one of the easiest things to just kind of compromise or to fill in with other activity. And Josh, I agree. This is where, for instance, I think as we mature, even our awareness of Sabbath practices, just to look at that specifically, also develops over time. It may follow, in some respects, it always does follow stage of life factors. What you're able to do as a young dad is different than what I'm able to do as a grandfather, for instance. So stage of life has some bearing on it. But to understand that this is for our good, and God has established it as a rhythmic perspective toward our week is really important.
That's good. Hey, if you've been watching and you've been with us for the last 40 minutes or so, start thinking about questions that you have for Phil. He'll be able to take some of those questions here in a little bit. But Phil, talk to us about this final discovery of finding your people, and how does that work, and what's that all about? And then also, for those of you who are viewing with us, and you can share your comment or ask your question to Phil as we begin to wrap up our episode here in about 15 or 20 minutes. But Phil, take us into finding our people. How do we do that?
Yeah. The common theme in, again, I'll just refer to some of the literature, some of the research, and so on, about adult learning in particular through difficulty, is other people, relationships. Theologically, it's probably patently obvious that we are not intended to manage life, to do life on our own. We just simply can't. The default pattern for many of us in difficulty, this is certainly true for me, the default pattern is to withdraw. When we're feeling overwhelmed, when we're feeling overly challenged, when there's a problem with other people or whatever it may be. For many of us, we withdraw. Others just pull up the bootstraps and fight. And either way, we compromise healthy, needful relationships. So other people really play the deciding, maybe even the cohesive role in all of this. I go back to finding my story. One of the ways that I find my story is talking with other people that I know well and who come to know me well, and we have opportunity to talk about each of our own stories, for instance. But I can't do that on my own. It comes from conversations with our spouse or with our children. We discover more about our story as we interact with other people. Same with our core, same with our sense of rhythm. In fact, we know, for instance, that exercise that is done outside is more holistically healthy is more holistically healthy than working out or exercising inside. But the X factor in either of those venues, inside or outside, is the social element. When we exercise outside with other people, then that ratchets up the benefit of the rhythm of physical exercise, for instance. Mm-hmm. So a running group is a great idea, or having a weight partner if you're working out in the gym. It's the same in every expression of our spiritual life. If we try to go it alone spiritually, and we just have our private devotions, then that's not going to be as effective as certainly building on time alone with the Lord, but having other people with us. I talk regularly with a counselor. I need somebody to help me stay emotionally adaptive and resilient. And so finding a counselor can be critical. Caring for your body by seeing a doctor, those kinds of things. We need other people. You got to find people, and they're going to, likely with stage of life, they're going to change. But finding people really is the cohesive element of those first three movements.
That's good.
So so help us categorize those people.
Yeah.
I hear you say you need a team, like you need the doctors, the counselors, those that are more in it's not like you're going to go to a counselor and then also share how they need to change, but you've got a team of maybe people in authoritative positions or in mentoring positions that are able to pour into you. And then also at the peer level, where there is a little bit more reciprocity.
Right.
Are there any other categories that you would put into that?
Well, certainly, yeah. If you look at it even from a mentoring perspective, mentoring those that are younger than us, there's value in that. Really, a healthy mentoring relationship, there's a lot of reciprocity in that. When I meet with students in a mentoring relationship, I tell them right up front, I will learn from this. I will grow from our relationship. This is not top down, one way, unilateral kind of set of conversations. There's a lot of self-disclosure that happens in these relationships at all levels. And with that self-disclosure comes a greater sense of self-awareness. And so again, we grow as a result.
Yeah, that's good. I think that there's a real value in seeking out, being intentional for us as leaders and seeking out those who we would consider wiser in an area, regardless of age. If they have experience, and we appreciate their leadership or they bring significant value to us, that we would seek them out. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes age does produce. It's just more experiences along the way so that they can identify different situations. But for us as leaders, like to be intentional about identifying people, but then if you identify them and ask them and you meet with them, you can't withhold from them, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's one thing that we really have to be thinking about is if I'm coming to you as, to Phil, I'm coming to you and saying, hey, can you talk about resiliency? Will you, help me work through a couple of things, like, ask me questions about my story or something like that, then I can't be like withholding information about my story, or else you're going to smell that and you're going to be like, nah, you're not going to be legit with me. Like there's something else in there. So you've got to kind of open yourself up to that. But I do think it's a lot easier to open up if I'm the one that's doing the choosing. Mm-hmm. So if I come to you and I'm choosing you, then that helps the relationship go further faster into a depth that's needed. Or else if it's just kind of this, like, we're kind of feeling it out, I'm not sure, it's going to take a long time for that relationship to get to a depth where you feel comfortable bringing some things out into the open about your story or core or whatever, your rhythms, whatever that might be. So being intentional leaders to go into that sphere and say, okay, who do I appreciate and who is maybe beside me, more advanced than me, who can I help advance? Those are the types of conversations that we need to have. Josh, you remember early in days of church planting, there was a group of church planters that we still, I don't know, I kind of yearn for some of those days, when we would all get together and cry and pray and preach at one another and complain and more than anything, we just would fall before the feet of the Lord together. And I think that was some of the most significant relationship, because we were all in the same trench together, Phil. Like we were all there together. We were feeling that pain together, and we were all trying to fight through that together, which is just an interesting, it's an interesting dynamic to be a part of.
Yeah. Sometimes as as pastors, it's no surprise, we've already figured this out, but we need somebody outside of our church or maybe even our denomination. When I was pastoring in upstate New York, I became really good friends with the Nazarene pastor in the same community. And we were good friends, and there were a lot of honest conversations that freed me to have necessary conversations with people in the life of the church, for instance, that maybe I might not have had I not had that kind of a relationship, because I knew I had that relationship, that outlet in a sense to go to. And so I think looking outside of our administrative relationships or so on, and having somebody that is more committed to us than they are to our organization, I think also is really vital. That if Clint, if I have that kind of relationship with you, I'm more concerned with you than I am with lead,
right,
and your role in lead, for instance.
Right. Yeah. That's good. Josh, what do you think was a part of our time with the other church planters in that group that helped you and I build resilience? Can you think back through some moments or over it was several years that we were connected to that group of guys. What do you think helped us build resilience out of that pod of dudes? What do you think?
I think things that we've talked about, the things that we became incredibly convinced were what God was doing and what God wanted to do. The reality that we weren't alone in that, while we were each leading different churches or ministries, that we weren't alone in some of those convictions that God had pushed on us. And then just that we could share openly and honestly about the things of leadership and of our lives that were going on. You felt heard, cared for, and supported in the midst of that were, for me, I think some of the biggest pieces.
Yeah, that was so good. I think, Phil, I think we've been really blessed. Josh and I would say both of us have been really blessed that we have been around some leaders throughout our career, that they were about us. And I know that I've been, in some situations, in some sin situations, even going to friends like Josh and even, superiors that I needed to report to, and confessing some of those things. And for me to be met with grace in the middle of that was overwhelming. I thought for sure, because I was believing the lie, they're going to kick me out. As soon as I say this, the relationship is going to end, because that was former history. That's below the line for me, right? As a part of my story. Yeah. And then there was an above the line. Even though the sin issue is below the line, above the line is how I was met with grace. Right. And those men cared for me more than they cared about my position, about my title, about anything else. Yep. They cared for me. They cared for my wife and I, and our young family. And so I think that was an unbelievable time for us to build resilience, that they cared for me more than the position that I carried. It was unbelievable. And now I get to treat others in the grace that was given to me, because it was modeled for me, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Phil, could you share, as we're talking about resiliency and leadership and ministry, could you share again your definition of resiliency?
Yeah, I don't want to overload or throw out too many terms, but very simply, I think it's the reintegrative and re-energizing capacity to respond to the disruptions of life.
Okay. And, so after things hit the wall, you want to get back in the game, and you will reintegrative. You want to, and you're ready. So here's my question: is somebody who has developed resiliency or has processed through these four areas that we've talked about, find your story, find your core, find your rhythm, and find your people. At the end of that, somebody who has developed resiliency, we know this is process. This is a lifetime.
It's a lifelong. Yep.
Right. What are some of the things that those people will say about their crucibles or about the difficult times that they've gone through?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that, because if we had had more time, I was going to tell some of my own stories, because I've had them, and as we all have. And I think, we've hit on many of those, either what will be said or how it will be said, but they will certainly respond. If this is what you're going for, they're going to respond with grace and patience and identification, a sense of empathy, not such that they can't be objective, but that they will recognize the nature of the pain. And I go back to the issue of burnout as a far less than satisfying alternative, because burnout tells me that we've really not addressed realistically or redemptively the pain of life. And another key theme that we won't have time to talk about is the impact of leadership cynicism. And I think that's the other alternative to the experiences of our lives, is that we become cynical. So I think those individuals are going to be honest in their own and transparent about their own experience. Clint hinted at this, but they won't shock easily. They won't judge, so they won't go, how could you have ever done that? Right. They will be fully present with you. They'll let you speak. And I think, again, going back to the role of a mentor or a pastor to help draw out from me, that person, to help draw out from me what God is truly saying to me. So as a mentor, as a leader, as a pastor, I'm listening to the Spirit, but I'm trusting that the Spirit of God is going to speak to them. And together we draw out what God has been saying.
That's good. Hey, before we get into final thoughts for the afternoon, we have a question from Jordan White, who's one of our lead grads, getting ready for graduation August 15th. Jordan, it'll be good to see you then. But this is what Jordan asks as a question. He says, thanks, guys, for the talk. Finding your people. Can you elaborate how you connected with the different mentors in your lives? So I think the question is, okay, there's more to come. Was it God who placed those folks in your life? Did you actively seek that mentorship? So was it kind of like God's providence and boom, you bumped into each other? Or was there action? Phil, take us into something like that. Do we need to wait for God to supply something, or do we need to be intentional? Is it both and? How does that work out for?
Yeah, I was going to say it's leaders? A yes to that. I have no doubt. I have been, especially as of late, I have been overwhelmed, staggered with the providence of God to bring people and other resources into my life that just come. I mean, it can be, this is beyond the mentoring thing, but I'll come to that. But just, it may even be reading a passage of scripture. We've all had, I think we've all had those kinds of experiences, but it's just been, it seems like a stream of them recently. And so I rely heavily on a perspective on God's sovereignty. He is active and speaking constantly. And so I'm watching for those cues. So is there a sense of waiting? Yes. Will God, in a sense, introduce or plop somebody into my life? Yeah, I think so. It may take time for trust to be built. It often does, as I disclose and they respond, and then I self-disclose more and they respond. So there is some element of passivity in that sense, and I'm waiting for God to bring people into my life. On the other hand, more often than not, if we're really moving deeper into resilience, we're going to recognize that we need somebody or somebodies to enter our life and to speak into our experience. And so I think our radar, our antennae are up. I think we're watching and listening for people in any number of contexts and see how they're responding, and then ask them, can we get together?
That's good. Jody McFarland
do that with me. They'll watch me in the classroom, the hallway. They'll see me with others or whatever, and then I'm in my office and say, "Will you serve as a mentor?" or something along that line.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Jody
McFarland just has okay. That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense, Phil. Jody McFarland has a question about a definition of burnout. So she just wants to know, can you give a definition of burnout? How do you know when you're burned out, and are there different types of burnout? So let's just give a quick definition of burnout here first, Phil.
Yeah.
What do you
actually,
think?
Clint, what I'll do is, if you know Jody, I'll send the email address of a colleague of mine here whose specialty is on pastoral burnout. She's finishing her doctorate, as a matter of fact, in that area. So if you remind me, or we at some way connect, she'll be able to respond far more, especially because of time too at this point, I suspect. Sure. But I think burnout is just that sense of emotional and physical, not just. It is a sense of emotional, physical, spiritual, relational exhaustion. I'm just done. I feel done. I don't have the energy to do this anymore. I don't have the will to do this anymore. And so if I go back to my research, one of the things that I did discover, and it's related to burnout, almost all of the leaders that I interviewed, virtually all of them, referred to a set of scenarios or situations that led up to often a precipitating event that brought on their real, the presenting problem. So I think burnout also obviously is that kind of a gradual depletion of energy, because I've not been able to, in a sense, find my story, my core, my rhythm, and my people.
That's good. Yeah, that's good. Josh, what would you add here to Jody's question? Anything about how do you know, and are there different types of burnout that leaders experience as you've talked with them?
I thought Phil did a great job kind of categorizing the different ways that we get exhausted. And like you said, I don't want to do it anymore, and I don't feel like I can do it anymore. Are those things. And we feel like that in our relationships. Like, I don't want to be in a relationship with those people anymore. I don't think I have what it takes to be in relationship with those people. I don't feel close to God. I don't want to be close. You pick those categories: spiritual, relational, emotional. And we realize that in the midst of the demands of leading, and again, leadership is demanding because you're taking people where they haven't been into a future that is uncertain. And so it's demanding. Mm-hmm. And you're going to be poured out. So how do you refill, and how do you again examine what's most important to you, and make sure you're intentionally choosing the things in your life, the rhythms, the people that are moving you towards what's most important.
That's good. Yeah, one activity that we give our lead students, and Jody, I'll point you back to the restoration assessment, the bucket tool, right? And we assess ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. I think we should probably address relationships too, but we don't. So 4 spheres, and we begin to monitor our energy level, right? 1 is low, 10 is high. And then we also talked about warning gauges. So when we talk about warning gauges, we're talking about one of the idiot lights on the dashboard of the car that's kind of dinging, going, hey, change the oil, right? And so we need to identify, when I'm cranky all the time, that probably means, whatever. If I feel bad in my body, like that means something is going on. When I'm like, for me, when I'm tempted to lie about something stupid, that means that one of my energy levels is low.
Right.
And so what do I have to do to build that energy level back up? And it doesn't have to be from 5 to a 10. It just means move it from 5 to a 6. Just get it 1 point better. So that may be as easy as take a walk. It may be to tell on myself. It may be, just to have a quick phone call with somebody to get me out and raise my energy level 1 point. It may be throw some worship music on. So there are these warning gauges that I need to know when the energy is running out. But then I also need to know what's my spiritual pathway in order to primarily, let's connect with Jesus. Let's run to him with all of our issues. But then also let's make sure that we have our people and our rhythms so that when we foul tip a pitch or we swing at a bad one, we can step back in. We can step out of the batter's box, adjust everything, feel everything on the bat, step back into the box, and do that ritual to get ourselves back into the present. So that we can go again, and that way our brains aren't stuck with us in the past. Yeah. That probably just tore off my final thought there. So let's get into final thoughts. I probably already have shared mine in conclusion, so maybe I won't do one today. But let's go with this. Josh, final thought for today coming out of this conversation. It's been great, but go ahead, share your final thought on this conversation today, Josh.
Yeah, it's been a joy to have our very own Dr. Phil here with us.
Yeah, let's not go there, Howard. Please. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your time, energy, and thoughts that you've put into this. When it comes to being a resilient leader, you have to recognize that you're going to have to slow down what feels productive in order to maintain over the long haul. So one of the things that we talk about in Lead all the time is that we want to train and equip men and women to be ministry leaders for 20, 30, 40 years, not just to be able to do ministry for a short period of time and not have the internal deep workings in order to be able to last. And so you need to create, I think the area of rhythms is so important in order to remind yourself what God is asking you to do, who you are in Christ, and what is most important to fulfilling what God is asking you to do. So I think that's my final thought for today. Phil, how about you?
That's great. Final thought, Phil.
Yeah, we were talking before we opened live, this current era of social unrest and COVID and just the nature of our culture, the divisions that are just rampant within churches. Josh, as you said, do we wear a mask? Do we not? Do we join in person? Do we not? I mean, it's just you cannot get away. Just cannot get away from it. And I think we were our culture was such, even before COVID hit, in which learning to become resilient, learning that we are innately resilient, but that we have the capacity to develop that innate quality is it's always been important. I mean, I can't imagine living in the Roman Empire era, I mean, there's no time in history when resilient leaders were not called for. But the challenges are such now that, as we pointed out earlier, I wonder what the church will look like, what church leaders will look like a year from now. And I think really being aware of who we are in Christ, how we relate to God's grand narrative of creation, fall, redemption, consummation. These are major themes that are really operational at the ground level, and being aware of our place there and who we are in Christ is absolutely essential. And as Josh, as you were saying, that we're in this for the long haul. I say to students, I want you to be doing, when you turn 25 or so, God's got another 40 years or 50 years, in mind for you, for many of you. So we're not just talking about getting through your 20s. We're looking at 45, 50 years of active ministry, and to do it well, to finish well. That's good. So I would encourage people to really, look to become more resilient.
Amen.
Yeah. And this is so important. Just my story. I never thought I was going to make it to 30. Like, I thought I was going to die before 30. I planned on being out in Africa or Asia somewhere telling people about Jesus and probably martyred. And so when I turned 30, I looked at my wife, Jen, and I said, I don't really know what to do with my life. And part of that was realizing I couldn't just head down, run, and not worry about the consequences, but that I needed to put some of these practices in place myself in order to be obedient to the Lord for the long haul.
Yeah.
You know, guys, 1 Timothy 4:16 says, watch your doctrine closely. No, actually it says, watch your life and your doctrine closely. And I think we watch our doctrine closely as ministry leaders, and some of the tribes that I've run with over the last 20 years, they watch their doctrine really closely. They forget to watch their life really closely. But this is the next, it says, persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. Yeah. And so to be able to do these things really well over the long haul is to watch my life. Let's pay attention, right, to these 4 arenas, and let's watch our doctrine closely as well. And so these two things marry together to persevere in them, to build resiliency, I'll say. Then we're going to do some manifest things over the course of our life and over our career. This also helps to make sure that our character will stay out and outpace our responsibilities, because as our responsibilities outpace our character is when we have a ministry fall, a moral failure, right?
Yeah.
But we need to make sure that our character will always outpace the arc of our responsibilities. Leaders, it's been great having
Hey, Josh,
Phil
could I
Howard
throw
with
one
us.
more reference?
Go ahead, dude.
Nope. One
Yeah,
more.
go for it.
I know
One more.
As you said that, I had this in some notes that I had put together that I think is relevant to all of this. So I'll just finish with this if I can. Hebrews 12 and 13. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees, make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. Amen. And I think if we need further motivation for becoming increasingly resilient, is that it's not just about us. As we strengthen our feeble arms and our weak knees, and we make level paths for our feet, it also has benefit for those that are lame, that they not be disabled, but they also be healed. And I think that that's just a reminder of the very significant role that we have to play as resilient leaders.
Amen. Phil, thanks so much for being with Josh and I today. We greatly appreciate you and your friendship and your ministry and this conversation. So thanks so much.
You're welcome.
We really appreciate it.
It was fun.
Josh, we'll see you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. And leaders, lead on.
We'll see ya.